All right, we'll be in Daniel chapter 8 tonight, and we're looking at more of Daniel's experiences here, some of his visions, and you would have seen a half sheet you could pick up on your way in to make sure we're following this. And I found that once I get going, I glance at the clock and it's 45 minutes later. So we'll see how the Spirit leads. I'm not planning extra long, but I wouldn't plan extra short either. We'll just walk our way through the chapter and appreciate it for what we have in front of us here. What has struck me in this chapter is actually the very last verse, and so I'll ask you to turn there to start us off. In chapter 8, verse 27, Daniel describes how he woke up from this dream and how it affected him. How does it affect him? What kind of dream is this? Is this a dream? Like, oh, I dreamed of this. Or is it more like a nightmare? Probably more like a nightmare, as you're seeing there, right? Fainted, I was sick, I was astonished, I was just stunned at what I saw in this dream, is what Daniel says. And so what we're going to see tonight, at face value, it's not something like, oh, I wish I had that dream. Think of Pharaoh waking up from Joseph, the dreams with Joseph. He wakes up and he's just troubled to try to make sense of it. That's kind of the impact of Daniel's dream here. We'll give some context. And what's fascinating is to understand that this is, chapter 8 is where, as Daniel's writing this account of his dreams or his stories, that he's switching from Aramaic, which is the international language, back to Hebrew. And so this is significant because it really helps us identify what his intended audience is. So now, because he's switching to Hebrew, we'll just remind ourselves, chapter 1 is written in Hebrew, likely to a Jewish audience. And that's the story of Daniel and his friends coming to Babylon. And then chapters 2 through 7 is Aramaic, likely for a broader audience than Jewish people. That was the common language of the government, of the culture of that time. And so Daniel needs to share these stories of Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, Daniel's own deliverance, and then that first vision last week we looked at in chapter 7, and these four kingdoms that follow each other until God, the Ancient of Days, claims the throne ultimately. And that the world needs to know this. But here in chapter 8, he's going back to Hebrew, and it's likely because he's focusing on God's people. And so this is another vision about what happens after Babylon. But what he's going to do in this, chapter 8, really through the rest of the book, it's more not just here's what's happening in the world, but here's what's happening and how it affects God's people. Because Israel is the apple of his eye. He loves these people, his chosen people. And so there's a special focus on the Jewish people here beginning in chapter 8 as Daniel gets more visions moving forward. So we'll walk our way through this chapter. And as we do, it's a pretty clear pattern. Like we've seen other times, he'll have the vision and then someone will interpret it for him. And so we'll kind of work our way through this. I'll start reading in just verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Ulai. So we want to get a sense of the setting, right? When is this happening? Well, I'm looking at verse 1. It says, under the king Belshazzar, year number 3, which is interesting because when was his other vision in chapter 7? You may want to flip a page back to chapter 7, verse 1. When was that vision? The first year, right? And this is still, Babylon's in control, but it's the end of the reign of Belshazzar, or it's the end of the kingdom of Babylon. It's the last king before they're taken over. Chapter 7 is the first year, and he's given this vision of 4 kingdoms. Now, 2 years later, as he's processing this is another vision that he has to try to make sense of. And this vision is going to detail the 2 kingdoms after Babylon. And what helps as well is to realize where he sees himself in this vision. In verse 2, he's at Shushan in the palace. Now, Shushan or Susa is another way of saying it. That's not in Babylon. Where is it? You can see it in the map, right? Babylon's here. Susa's over here. This is actually the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. Think other stories in the Bible set in Persia. What are the stories later in the timeline of the Bible? Who else shows up after the story of Daniel? The Persians, yeah. So Jewish people, their stories are set in Persia. Who else? What other stories are in Persia? When you think Esther, the story of Esther in chapter 1, verse 1, that palace is in Susa or Shushan. Or Nehemiah, chapter 1, verse 1. He's the cupbearer, and he's sent back to Jerusalem to help rebuild it, right? Well, you're Daniel. You're not living in Susa. You're living in Babylon, right? You're focused on helping to serve the king. Like we just read in the last verse of the chapter. He focuses on the king's business. Well, here in this vision, apparently he's transported, and he sees himself in the capital of a different kingdom, of a foreign kingdom, and perhaps a rising kingdom. And that's important because he's just seeing the bigger picture, right? He's along this Ulai River or canal there in Shushan. And it's just already going to set the tone of something else is coming. And that also makes sense now when he comes to Belshazzar, and Belshazzar says, what is this writing on the wall? Well, Daniel's already had 2 visions telling him that the Medo-Persians are next. And so when he reads the headlines and the Persians are threatening Babylon, he knows to take this seriously, right? So these visions help him prepare for chapter 5 and that account. So we'll focus in on the vision itself. Starting in verse 3, we'll kind of follow along and get a sense of this vision. I lifted up mine eyes and saw, behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns. The 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other. The higher came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beasts might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will, and became great. Another translation says he magnified himself. So here's one animal, this ram. What comes next? Verse 5. As I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler. He's enraged against him, and he smote the ram, brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great. You could say he magnified himself. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. So we've seen this ram, and then this goat, and we'll continue on now to something else. Verse 9, out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great, toward the south, toward the east, toward the pleasant land. That's a term referring to Israel. And it waxed great. He grew larger, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground, stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself, even to the prince of the host, the prince of this host that was cast down. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression. And it cast down to the ground, or cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning this daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? He said unto me, how long?
3.5 years.
Actually, not this math. 2,300 days, over 6 years. Interesting. Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So we'll just recap this in our minds, right? You have this, verses 3 and 4 is this ram, a male sheep. How many horns does he have? 2 horns, right? Budding west, north, south, completely unstoppable. And the effect is that he has this power and this authority that no one can match. End of verse 4, he did according to his will. Whatever the guy wants to do, he wants. Ultimate authority. And then after that ram, you have this goat now with one horn coming from the west at fantastic speed. You notice the detail, not even touching the ground, like he's going that quickly, right, is the idea. And this goat has one horn right between the eyes, centered, balanced, positioned for the maximal impact. And did you notice it's just the intensity of that collision, right? He's enraged and he just smacks hard against this ram, destroys him, shatters the two horns, throws him to the ground, tramples on him. And the same thing again, I'm looking down to verse 8 now. He waxed very great. The guy grows large. He magnifies himself, as the same language as verse 11. And yet, that single horn doesn't stay indefinitely, right? For some reason, the great horn's broken. And it divides up into how many horns after that? 4 more horns, right? And if you're a history buff, ancient Near Eastern history, you're thinking, okay, this sounds actually like last week in chapter 7, this leopard with wings, this 4 heads. So, and we're going to be told here in just a moment that what it is. It's Greece. It's Alexander the Great. But at the time, Daniel's just seeing this vision. He's not told what it means. And then out of that, you have this last little horn that shows up. Where does that horn come from? Verse 9. He comes out from among those 4 horns. Interesting. He grows great, focuses on the south and the east, the pleasant land, like we said, this, referencing the land of Israel here. And he grows to a tremendous extent, high enough to displace the stars, this host. And if you read verse 10 and 11 again, you'll see this host idea, this group that is significant, and yet the group of it is torn down. And then the prince of this group, this host, he magnifies himself against that prince. And then verse 12, the host was given to him, even with the daily sacrifice. And so this little horn has power over this host, that he's displaced, he's mocked their prince, and now he has this temporary authority over them and their daily sacrifices. And he mocks even truth itself. And end of verse 12, he practices, he prospers. Whatever he wants to do, he does. Firm control. A stunning kind of set of visions that Daniel has. And notice the basis for this. In the middle of verse 12, by reason of what? What's the reason given for his authority? This powerful but temporary authority. You're going to see in verse 12, it's by reason of transgression. For some reason, there was some sin that was so great and extravagant that this little horn is given an unusual amount of power and authority over that. And because of this, the result is, again, he has unrivaled power. Whatever he wants to do, he does. And you notice there's this certain time frame, 2,300 days, evenings, mornings, that's really clear like a day, right? 6 and change years. And then the sanctuary is cleansed. We have a lot of questions right now. And if you're Daniel, you have a lot of questions too, right? It's one thing for us to try to jump ahead to what the beasts represent, but I think it's helpful for us just to pause, put yourself in the place of Daniel, and just this dream itself is fascinating, traumatizing. This animal just viciously crushes another animal along the bank of the river at nighttime. And you're just stunned and trying to make sense. And then this other horn grows out of that original goat and it gets this unusual amount of power, magnifies himself again. Daniel's got questions. We do too. So let's keep reading. We want to get a sense of the interpretation. And just like last week, I love how there's a really short version of the interpretation and a long version.
Can't do a cliffhanger this time. You got people that won't be here.
Yeah, I can't do no cliffhangers. Mike, we did cliffhangers for all the stories of Daniel. You can come back next Sunday if you want. We'll just stop here. No. So verses 15 to 17 begins the interpretation side of it. Oh, we'll do the short version in a minute here. Verse 15, it came to pass when even I, Daniel, this is me again, and that sounds familiar because I'm going back to chapter 8, verse 1. This appeared to me, Daniel, like I'm the guy doing this. So now verse 15, I'm Daniel, me. I saw the vision, I sought for the meaning. Then behold, look, there stood before me as the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. We'll pause there. So one Holy One tells this other one Holy One, go inform Daniel. What name does he give him? Who is this guy? Gabriel. That sounds familiar. Where else do we see Gabriel? He's an angel. Yeah.
This is the one that led to Mary, right?
Exact same one. Yeah. Some, 400 years later, appears to Mary to give her a special message from God, and Zechariah, and both times he tells them, don't be afraid. Must be a terrifying sight. If we saw him today, we would be like stunned, and perhaps if we've seen so many sci-fi movies, it wouldn't scare us as much as it would initially. But for someone who hasn't had like CGI effects movies, it's like, what is this? This is the real thing, this terrifying angel who approaches Daniel. And Daniel falls on his face in front of him. And then notice what he calls him down in verse 17, Son of Man. And that's a common phrase that's a little different from the Son of Man in chapter 7. But Ezekiel is called this a lot. It's just, you're a man, you're human. I have a special message for you. And he just says, this vision, this is about the time of the end. But that's all he says at first. So if we're like, Daniel, what does this mean? Oh, it's about the end. Okay, I want more than that. Give me more details. And so he expands a little bit. But even that amount has another stunning effect on Daniel. Let's keep reading verse 18. As he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground. Daniel's just overwhelmed by the vision, by this angelic person coming up and beginning to explain this to him. Daniel's overwhelmed. He just collapses. But he touched me, set me upright. And he said, behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. I'm going to tell you what happens at the end of this anger time, because this is referring to the time of the end. And then he begins to explain. Finally, explanation here, right? The ram which thou sawest, 2 horns, the kings of Media and Persia. Got it. The rough goat is the king of Grecia. The great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. He begins to explain. I'm going to tell you what happens at the end. It connects to the end times. Who's the ram? Those 2 horns? Medo-Persia. And that matches the capital where Daniel had been. It's meaningful. Persia is the second partner that grew up after it connected with Media, and yet Persia grew larger than Media itself. Their kingdom extended the same directions, north, southwest, and in fact, in their coinage, they were represented by a ram. That was their kingdom logo, was a ram, if you will. So it's fitting that they'd be a ram here in this account and this vision from Daniel. And then you have the goat. Who's the goat? Yeah, this Greek king, Alexander the Great. Right now I'm listening just for fun to a podcast telling his story of his rise and his empire. And it's uncanny. The stage is set for this guy. His dad was growing this huge army, and his dad just happened to be assassinated just as Alexander's ready to rise to power. Raises some questions. Was this like underhanded? Was he just plotting to get rid of his dad? We don't know, but all I know is once he took control of the greatest army in the world, he just developed this lightning attack style. Quick attacks, goes right against Medo-Persia, destroys it completely. But then after that, he dies at a young age, right? Remember the classic idea? He weeps because there's no more world to conquer. He just is a rising star, and yet he dies suddenly. And after he dies, his kingdom is spread out among 4 generals who take 4 different parts of his kingdom. In fact, Daniel's going to predict this much more vividly in chapter 11. He just describes it in detail, so much detail that people have a hard time believing that it's predicted ahead of time. If they're not Christians, they're like, this can't be true. There must be another Daniel who wrote like closer to the time of Jesus. Which isn't true. I mean, this is as Daniel himself, the historical figures, writing this. Let's keep reading now, because verse 23 focuses in on that little horn. In the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, there's that transgressor idea again. When it's fully fulfilled, all the transgressions have happened. A king of fierce countenance and understanding, dark sentences shall stand up. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power, and he shall destroy wonderfully, odd combination of words, and shall prosper in practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. He shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand, like not by any human effort. And the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. It's the end of this account. So what's this little horn? Notice the timing. I'm going to go back to verse 23. It's at the end of the kingdom of the four kingdoms. When Greece is finished, this little horn will come up. And this is what's really going to help us make sense of this little horn, this figure who comes up at the end of the empire of Greece. Now, if I go back to chapter 7, there's another little horn, but he follows a different kingdom. What kingdom does the little horn follow in chapter 7? Back in chapter 7, there are four kingdoms. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. After Rome is when they have the 10 kings, and the little horn shows up there. This, at this point, seems like it's a different little horn because it follows Medo-Persia. And not, or Greece, and not Rome. Interesting. But it still is a time when transgressions are come to the full. And then he describes the characteristics of this king, right? A strong face, this language that he can use, kind of intrigue. He's a diplomat. He knows how to say one thing and mean something else and stir the pot behind the scenes. Understanding dark sentences, that's the idea. He rises up, his power is mighty, but it's not his own power. No, there's no
Dark sentences.
Yeah, it's like veiled language is the idea. I'm going to say this, but notice what my friend says around the corner, right? Wink, wink, wink. So it's like this intrigue, this backstage plots.
I was thinking dark as like evil.
Yeah, I think the idea there is more like hidden or veiled is the concept. But it's evil at the same time, right? And it's powerful, but it's not by his own power. This is where maybe there's demonic involved here. He's really good at destroying things. He destroys things in a wonder-inducing way. You see the way he destroys, and you're terrified of it. And he does whatever he wants. He prospers, practices, and then he focuses on the mighty and then the holy people. That may be a reference to that host idea from earlier in Daniel's vision. And he has this craft that prospers in his hand. He's skilled at what he does. Everything he does prospers. And he magnifies himself in his heart. So you see his characteristics, his actions.
Sounds like an antichrist.
Sounds like an antichrist, right? Yeah. And at the end, he will stand up against the prince of princes. And then he'll be broken without hand. Like no human is involved in his defeat at the end, right? So we have a question, who is this guy? Is really one of the broadest questions here. What helps us to recognize this is likely referring to someone who comes up before Christ. His name is Antiochus Epiphanes. And I'll explain more in a minute, but it also is a preview of the Antichrist. It's the one guy who comes and ruins Israel before the first coming of Christ. But he's a preview of the Antichrist who's going to come even more. So a couple things that help me think about this. First of all, like we mentioned, he's not connected to the end of Rome. He comes after Greece. And Antiochus Epiphanes, this is kind of an artistic rendering of him. I doubt that he posed for this drawing. But it's just a sense of it. There's a lot of inscriptions of him, but when he was rising in power, he's not Roman, but he comes and he is connected to one of those 4 kingdoms from Alexander the Great. He attacks Israel because that's the buffer between 2 of the kingdoms. And when he comes and he ravages them completely. I'll just mention some of the timing. So he attacked Israel from 171 BC to 165 BC, 6 years. And that matches the 2300 days reference here. And when he comes, he's ruthless. He wants to ruin their religion. He stops all the sacrifices. In fact, he sacrifices a pig on the altar of the temple just to desecrate it, to ruin it, to corrupt it. Bans all copies of the scriptures, hates the Jewish people, crucifies like up to 100,000 of them. Just attacks them viciously. And then he dies suddenly. There are historical records of the Maccabees. So you say Maccabees, it sounds like one of the Apocryphas, right? I don't think it's scripture, but it is a historical record of what happened between Old and New Testaments. And that's when they describe his death as suddenly, either by like a heart attack, or one idea is like he gets worms in his stomach and he dies a gross death. That's like judgment, perhaps. But at the end of his reign, when they reinstate the sacrifices, this is where you get the stories of Hanukkah and the Maccabees who fight back against their pagans, and they get rid of them, and here's this miraculous candle that's lit again. It all matches the end of this period of no sacrifices. So all these things lead us to think, you know what, this little horn from chapter 8 seems to be describing that guy, and it matches, okay, maybe the Jewish people are back from exile, but they're still not following God. Their transgressions are filled up. Another judgment until the Messiah comes. That's going to sound familiar because we know the little horn from chapter 7 is predicted to come in the future. Just like this one who magnifies himself in his heart against God, against the Prince of Princes, until the Son of Man comes. Until the Messiah comes. So it's likely what Daniel's hearing is, for your people, the Jewish people, need to know there is someone coming who will just ravage them as a punishment for sins. And yet, that's not the end of the story, because he has a little timeline. He's got an expiration date before he too is going to die. And verse 26, the angel finishes by just saying, listen, this is such a powerful vision. It's true. Shut it up, seal it, secure this, because people need to read this in the future. If you're Daniel and you've heard kingdom follows kingdom, but then there's just one guy coming who's just going to completely ravage the beautiful land and its inhabitants, and he's going to ruin the sacrifices, you're stunned. If you're Daniel in this case, right? And so the effects, verse 27, he's exhausted. He's expected to continue doing the regular business, but it's just, what did I just see and experience? And that's the end of the chapter. We're used to hearing, and then the kingdom of God is established. And it is, but not in this vision. I'm sorry, Dave, but chapter 8 is a cliffhanger. The whole chapter is. Because at the end, you're waiting to see what happens next, and nothing shows up. So we just walked through the vision, the interpretation. What stood out to you? What were some of the big ideas where you're like, wow, it just... For me, it was just helpful to refresh myself on this. Yeah, Cliff.
Senator Costas, was he around the same time, shortly after Alexander died?
This guy here, Epiphanes, somewhat, like 100 or 200 years later.
Say Alexander's kingdom broke up into 4 parts.
Yeah, and out of the 4, he ends up taking control and he attacks Israel here. So it would match the timeline of chapter. Not that closely connected. Because he says out of the 4, one little horn comes up. So he's like within the kingdoms, but he's not one of the 4 generals. It's a little bit later after that. Yeah. Let me just summarize some big themes then for us. What really strikes me as I read through this chapter is this conflict, right, of power. You have leader after leader after leader, and you may have caught the theme by now. They all think they're the greatest. They all magnify themselves until the next guy comes and knocks them down.
Yeah, but then they don't bother Israel every time, right?
And that's the challenge too, yeah. In this case especially, he's given this temporary window to really afflict Israel extra until he gets wiped out. So you see this constant conflict, and especially this last guy, this little horn, he's like defying God himself, the prince of the hosts.
So Jerusalem was fixed again, and then he's coming back.
And destroys it again. And that's why when the Romans come in, they build it again. So Herod's temple is the temple that's kind of restored when the Romans come in. Yeah, I mean, and I haven't followed the history of Jerusalem extra carefully, but I know it just gets conquered, built up, conquered again frequently, because it's right there. It's the center, it's like the crossroads of the ancient world.
Alexander, when he first came down, didn't go near Israel.
No, that wasn't because he's focused on Babylon, he's focused on the capitals. Yeah, so he didn't wipe it out like that. But
They didn't bother.
yeah, but Antiochus Epiphanes did. He wanted to claim that border between the two rival kingdoms at the end of Greece's influence there. Let me suggest another thing here. You saw this idea, transgression shows up. Verse 12, by reason of transgression, the sacrifices. But then verse 23, when the transgressors are come to the full. When everything is full, the king has this ultimate authority. When the transgressors are completed. And it reminds me of Genesis 15:16. It's when God is talking to Abraham, and he tells Abraham, your descendants are going to go to another foreign country for 400 years. Why? Because in this country of Canaan, the iniquity of the Amorites is not full yet. They need to sin so much that it warrants serious judgment. Now that it's full, 400 years later, now your people are going to come back, and it's righteous for me to wipe them out as a society. It's similar here, right? When the transgressions are full, when God's people, maybe they keep just ignoring him, even with all the prophets, this is another round of judgment. And yet, here comes the Messiah after that. So it's not judgment and that's it. Judgment to restore. And then also matches this last idea, which is so fascinating to me, right? This is written in Hebrew again. God is aware of the pleasant, the beautiful land. We referenced the host in verses 11 and 12. Verse 10, 11, and 12. This host is this group of people that this little horn starts to overcome. He magnifies himself even where he's threatening their prince. They're given his control and authority in verse 12 for a temporary time. They're trampled under him for days of desolation. And yet, it's not forever. They actually count the days that he's going to have this influence. And I love this, right? You have a feeling evil's winning. This chapter of my life is really dark. Those days are numbered. The days of evil are always numbered. It's not indefinite. It feels like it at times. But I'm so thankful that God's like, all right, I'm going to tell you exactly how many days I'm going to allow them to have temporary influence. Because once they're finished that desecration and the sacrifices and the judgment, that's it. He's judged. And it shows God in firm control of the whole time. And he still shows attention to his people. That's why he wants Daniel to record this vision for them to reference. So let me finish with 3 quick applications for us. We want to just make sure we remind ourselves to beware of the devastation that's caused by sin. Maybe we're affected by other people's sin, and we're devastated by that. Or sometimes we sin, and it's so easy to think that we can sin and get away with it, right? But we can't sin and win. That's not how God works. Be not deceived, Galatians tells us. God is not mocked, right? Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. If I think that I can sin and get away, then I am a fool. Sin yields corruption. Sin brings consequences, whether we're among God's people, a believer or otherwise. And then you even see how Daniel responds when he just sees this vision. It's just by looking at the vision, it affects him, let alone living through it. It's just a heavy reminder for us. We cannot sin and expect to win. At the same time, we want to make sure we keep receiving comfort from the true King, because he sees his people. He knows. He knows the hairs in our head. When a sparrow falls to the ground, he knows. He gives his attention to his people. He ensures that we are not forgotten. And even if I am in a dark chapter or a dark place, it's a temporary situation. Those days are numbered. And so you can get great comfort from this King and following him and knowing that his power will win. He will rule. If wicked is temporarily ruling, it's because God has allowed it and he has predicted it and he will limit it and he will judge it. I love how God is the king over evil. And then in contrast with everybody we read about in this chapter, we want to make sure we magnify the true King, right? Not magnify ourselves and our hearts. Not magnify meaning like build ourselves up, exalt ourselves. You don't want to try to be a rival with God. We've said this before. We make very poor gods. We don't want to match God's status. I don't want to look in the mirror and say, yeah, this is really, this person in the mirror is as good as God. No, that's foolish, right? And so you don't want to exalt yourself against him. Instead, align yourself with him. And what was fascinating to me, this matches exactly what we read about this morning, right? Paul's mission is to magnify Christ with all boldness, whether by life or by death in his body. And so that's our heartbeat then. We want to magnify our true King. Point other people to the good King, not the evil underlord, but the perfect King and the one who knows us and will care for us. And he will judge all sin. And thankfully, he has taken the judgment for our sin on himself on the cross. Many, many reasons to magnify him. Let's bow in prayer. Lord, we've read a story which it's sobering. There is much devastation that happens downstream from sin. And we marvel that on the one hand you judge sin so ruthlessly, but it's because you're that righteous and holy and sin is that heinous against you. And so we tremble to think that we could be like those evil kings and magnify ourselves and think that we can do whatever we want. How dangerous that is. How foolish that is. And so we pray that you would help us as your people not to fight against you or to question you or think that you've forgotten about us. Oh Lord, help us to take comfort in you, our good God. Help us to be reassured of your love, of your presence, of your attention. You know us. You know our name. You know our unique circumstances. The days of our troubles are numbered. And we praise you, Lord, that very soon we will be in your presence and we will be singing to you, magnifying you, seeing you with eyes more vividly than Daniel's own vision was. We thank you that you can empower us to live by faith this week. And so please help us again to magnify you. Help us to love you and point other people to you, our good, our true, our sovereign King. In Jesus' name, amen.